All right. Hi, everyone. Can you all see and hear me okay? Excellent. So we've got a little bit of catch up to do. Um, Firstly, we made it just about through the slides for the essay writing lecture, and I'm wondering if anyone has any questions about that assignment. And keep in mind, first thing I'm going to say is I'm thinking that I will provide a list of possible topics. So I'm just putting that out there. If you think that would be helpful, I'll come up with, I can't say for sure how many, um, at least five, um, but a list of possible essay topics, just kind of based on what's in the textbook. Do you think you guys will find that helpful? Okay, perfect. Excellent. Okay, so that's what I'll do. I'll probably get that done, I don't know, sometime over the weekend, and then I'll post it on Brightspace. Otherwise, are there any other questions about the either the proposal or the essay? There certainly is a due date. Yes. That was covered last time. Yeah, all the due dates are in your course outline, by the way. So if you're not sure, you can look at the lecture recording or take a look at the course outline. Everything's in there. Anything that like I haven't covered though, any questions about anything maybe I missed? Yeah, I suppose you could do that, Pernille. That could make a good topic. Kind of like try and make it so that you're, trying to convince the reader that you've arrived at a correct definition of mindfulness and use what we're learning here to support your understanding or your definition of mindfulness. That could work. All right, so one thing we've got to do um, is finish off our discussion of feminist epistemology. Now, before we got to the essay writing lecture, we were right about here on the second to last slide. We were talking about reason as a gendered concept. Um, we're going to just cover this last slide real quick before we launch into perception. So the criticisms of the feminist epistemologists lead us to these two alternatives that Crumley outlines. There's feminist standpoint epistemology and feminist naturalized epistemology. Standpoint epistemology says that knowledge is the outcome of the sort of social processes that we were talking about before, right? Science is a social process in that it's done by scientists who are, and this is true, people, and therefore the knowledge that they produce is also a social product. And while traditional epistemology has sort of privileged the perspective of men, feminist standpoint epistemologists say that instead what we should do is privilege the understanding of women and other marginalized groups, since if we look back through the history of science, they've been quite underrepresented. And then we should work to be less biased ourselves, like all of us, while doing science, while also realizing that science is never going to be completely value free, because again, it's done by people, right? So that's feminist standpoint epistemology. Think of it like this: the standpoint as in a perspective, right? Within this social system. Feminist naturalized epistemology combines Quine's natural epistemology with some of the critiques of traditional epistemology that we covered last time, uh, last um, last week. um, uh, they agree. The naturalized epistemologists or feminist naturalized epistemologists agree that what we're doing as scientists and philosophers is situated in a particular social and historical context. Um, it's from that sort of position that we actually determine um, the uh, what our scientific hypotheses and theories are going to be. Another thing that kind of differentiates it, though, is that it like natural epistemology, this is what differentiates it from feminist standpoint epistemology, is it treats epistemology as a sort of extension of the sciences or part of the sciences rather than prior to the sciences, whereas feminist standpoint epistemology is maybe a little bit a priori when it comes to the role uh, of epistemology. Although, that's debatable, I suppose. Um, After all, they are taking into account the the socially situated nature of the sciences, which is an empirical observation, right? So that those are the two alternatives that Crumley has for us, and that's really it for our lecture or for our little completion of the lecture on new directions in epistemology. Are there any questions about any of that material before we move on to perception? Nicholas, go ahead.
I have a question, but I need to quickly flip through my notes first. So if you want to start, and I'll come back around in like 2 minutes and actually
Okay,
ask it.
sure. Okay, so the topic for today, excuse me while I tie my shoe, is perception. Um, this is one of my favorite chapters in Crumley's textbook. And I hope we'll see. I'm able to kind of convey why as we make our way through the material. Um, we're still doing epistemology, but we're also sort of wading into the topic of the mind, because perception is a mental sort of process, right? Perceptions are mental events. Okay, Nicholas, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Is there like a difference between someone who is just I guess a or believes in natural epistemology and someone who also believes in feminist epistemology as opposed to just a feminist naturalized like does the combination of these two positions result in something more complex, or is it just like these two positions together is what this is?
The way I understand it is it's kind of just like the feminist natural epistemologists are just natural epistemologists who are also feminists when it comes to epistemology. But,
Okay.
keep in mind that it's a diverse bunch of people. So you're going to get various, depending on who you ask and what you ask them about, you're going to get various answers, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's generally the way I understand it.
Sounds good. Makes sense. I couldn't really see much of an overlap between, or not couldn't see the overlap, but I was struggling to see how those two different positions would, uh,
Yeah. I
I
mean, it's
guess.
like they both differ from traditional epistemology, but the standpoint epistemologists differ from traditional epistemology in terms of their feminism and their feminist critiques of epistemology and science. But the feminist natural epistemologists, the naturalized epistemologists, differ with respect to that, as well as where epistemology sits within our whole knowledge generating enterprise. So like, and the key to that is again, they see epistemology as part of the sciences rather than prior to the sciences.
Okay, makes
Yeah,
sense. Thank you.
no problem. Okay, so perception. Why is perception such a cool topic to discuss? Well, let's all stop and kind of think about how we know about the world around us, right? We know it, and I realize some of you may be more or less empiricist, more or less rationalist, but we can all agree that we can look around with our our vision, we can listen to what's happening with our auditory senses, etc. And those senses will deliver information about the world to us. Um, Obviously, we can run through the examples if we want to, right? Eyes for seeing, ears for hearing. Um, we have this sort of classic five senses in addition to sight and hearing. We have taste, touch, and smell. Of course, we have other sense modalities that we kind of don't talk about as much in day-to-day life. Um, we have senses like proprioception. So proprioception is kind of like your sense of what your body is doing, right? Like I can tell that I have my hand raised right now. I don't have to look and go, oh, there, my hand is up. No, I just kind of know it's up, right? Um, And then again, our scientific understanding of the senses has changed too. I mean, now, we treat in everyday vernacular smell and taste as if they're completely different sense modalities. Really, they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. I mean, sure, there are taste receptors on the tongue, but much of our sense of taste actually is just our sense of smell. And that's why when you have a cold, it's hard to taste things because a big part of your apparatus for tasting is actually olfaction, right? Um, so we don't need to generate too many examples. It's pretty straightforward. We open our eyes and we see the world. Um, we put our ear to something and listen. We put our nose to something and smell it. And this delivers information about the world. Now, what kind of assumptions are baked into this notion of perception? There's a few that are noteworthy. One is that we take for granted that there are actual physical objects out there, right? Like if I'm, I don't know, making supper, I've got a pot of something stewing away on the stove, and I lean in to smell it, and I think, "Ooh, that smells good. That smells like it's about done." I'm kind of taking for granted that there is a world out there, and there's this pot of, I don't know, dinner on the stove, and it really exists. Um, and moreover, we take for granted that these physical objects are mind independent on the one hand and publicly accessible on the other. What does that mean? Mind independent. That means that those objects continue to exist independently of whether or not there's somebody around to perceive them. Like this picnic table that I'm sitting at. Every time I come and deliver a lecture, the table is still here. The table continues to exist, whether I am here to perceive it or interact with it. And then you might say, well, there's plenty of other people around. They can perceive the table while you're not here. Yeah, you're right. But at some point, there's not going to be anybody around to perceive the table. Maybe over the winter break, there's nobody on campus in this area for a few hours. Nobody's perceiving the table, but when someone comes back, the table is still there. The table has a mind independent existence, we would say, right? Question. Um, well, sure, but the object, it doesn't matter what we call it. Um, it does, it continues to exist is the assumption we're working with, right? It doesn't pop out of existence. We could call it something else and conceptualize it differently, but the point is, it doesn't pop out of existence just because nobody's around looking at it, right? Um, well, Khalid, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. But we're not really dealing with like naive realism doesn't because what naive realism is concerned with is how we perceive the world rather than how hallucinations work. Although when we talk about phenomenalism next time, we'll come back to this concern about illusions or hallucinations. Actually, we're going to talk about illusions momentarily. So that's one assumption. There are mind independent physical objects, The second assumption is that these objects are publicly accessible. Well, I'm explaining that right now. So publicly accessible means they're there and whoever's kind of around can perceive them, right? It's not like, Socrates' daimonion, who only he could hear, right? Socrates claimed to have a spirit who um, directed him, kind of like a conscience, right? But only he could hear it. Um, Publicly accessible means they're out there in the world. Anybody could, in principle, investigate it with their senses. Like this tree beside me, it's just kind of there. You can go and look at it. It's not like I'm the only one who can see the tree, right? Sort of, yeah, a bit like that. Although that's a naive realist would say yes. If the tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, it does make a sound because the sound is real out there in the world, mind independent, and publicly accessible. So it exists whether there's somebody around to hear it, whether or not there's somebody around to hear it. Another assumption. So, number one, there are physical objects. Number two, they're mind independent and publicly accessible. Number three, the qualities that we sense, the warmth of my coffee, the solidity of the table, the green on the leaves of the trees, etc. Those sensible properties are in the objects themselves. So those are the assumptions baked into this sort of common sense view of perception. That's naive realism. Now, I wonder how many of you think of perception this way. And again, no judgment. This isn't like a trick question. But it's a common sense view of perception, meaning it's like it's how it seems to us. So I wonder how many of you have thought about how perception works and whether you think the story that naive realism paints makes sense. Okay, so Nicholas might disagree that the qualities are in the object. So it sounds like you might not be a naive realist. How do we apply this to universals that is real? Well, we're talking about physical objects rather than universals. So it doesn't really apply to universals. But we will talk about universals starting next week. So um, hopefully that will be illuminating. Yeah. So Pernille maybe also not a direct realist. Right? What this is saying basically is like, okay, there's a physical object, say this coffee cup, that exists independently of whether anyone's around to perceive it. So it's mind independent. It's publicly accessible. People walk by could see that I have a coffee cup in my hand. But most importantly, the qualities that we sense, like the cylindricality, the warmth, the taste of the coffee, even, are all in the objects themselves, not in the mind. That's perhaps the most naive part of naive realism, and we'll see this if we reflect on it just a little bit. So, before we look at some examples, it's worth noting. Um, this sort of common sense view, that is naive realism, is a subtype, if you like, of direct realism. And the mind independent objects, the objects that exist out there in the world, that's the realism of direct realism, right? Realism means things exist it mind independently. They're real in the sense that they're out there. It doesn't matter if I'm around or anyone else is around to perceive them or interact with them. They exist. Um, so while naive realism is a type of direct realism, not all direct realists endorse the claims of naive realism. In fact, I think very few do. because naive realism is again a common sense view, which is why we call it naive realism. I hope I just answered your question, Yusuf. Yeah, it's naive because it's like common sense. It's like we kind of take it for granted, but we haven't really thought about it. You know what I mean? On direct realism, more generally, we directly perceive physical objects and their properties. Um, and I'll expand on this in a moment, but direct realism does not necessarily um, countenance the idea that perception is like our common sense experience reveals to us. So I'll come back to that point on the next slide. Don't worry about it too much for now. Now, critics of naive realism and direct realism both object to it on a couple of different grounds. Um, Critics of direct realism might say that direct perception is not nearly as direct as it seems, right? Can you see why? Some of you were kind of hinting at this earlier. I mean, basically, Galen, yeah. A lot of stuff happens. Well, so the question was, why wouldn't direct perception be as direct as it seems? And the answer to that question is that a lot of stuff happens between, I guess, what we'll say the object and the mind of the perceiver, right? So if I look at this tree, it's not a simple matter of opening my eyes and, oh, there's the tree, right? Sunlight has to shine down upon the trunk and the branches and the leaves. Some of that light is scattered all over the place, and then some of that light reflects or hits my retina, hits my rods and cones, which photo transduce the light into neural signals, which travels through the optic tract down the optic nerve into my occipital cortex, and so on and so on and so on until I have a visual representation of the tree. That does not sound very direct, does it? Right? Yeah, like well, maybe, but that's not really the worry. The worry is the concern here is just that it's not very direct. Like if the claim is I just perceive the tree directly, then that's got to be wrong according to, as we'll see, the representative realists. Because it's not direct. There are tons of intermediate steps that happen in between the tree and the mind of the perceiver. So that's why. Also, the sensible qualities, those are said, again, to be in the object. Do you think that makes sense? Like when I look at the trees and I see the leaves are green, where is the green? Is the green in the leaves? What do you think? No green in there, Nicholas says. What if I were colorblind, right? And I looked at the leaves, and then somebody who was not colorblind said, those are green. I would have to take their word for it, potentially, depending on the kind of colorblindness I have. I could say, well, they don't look green to me. In fact, I don't really know what green looks like. Um, so how can the sensible qualities be in the object, right? Actually, there's somebody taking their lovely little pupper for a stroll, and I think dogs can see fewer colors. You know, that reminds me that dogs actually see fewer colors than people do. If dogs did philosophy, the question of whether certain colors are in the object wouldn't occur to them, right? But or think about if you're like a bird or a bee, right? These creatures can see into the ultraviolet part of the spectrum, so they can see colors that we can't see. are those colors that we can't see in the objects themselves, right? So these are some of the problems that naive realism runs into. Ooh, I've got to zip my jacket up. It's quite cold out here. There we go. I don't know what I'm going to do when winter comes. I have to find a spot inside, I suppose. Yeah, well, we know that that's how it works, Khalid, right? But does is that an answer to the question, where is the green? Is the green in the object? I'm not trying to say yes, it is or isn't, or even that there is a location for the greenness of green things we experience. I actually don't think there is. Um, but this is just to show that naive realism doesn't really have answers for this sort of problem, right? Okay, moving on. Direct realism, whether that is true, would have epistemological consequences that we're interested in, right? Think about our justification conditions that we spoke about in a previous lecture, right? If I form the belief that there's a red apple in front of me, my justification depends on my experience of redness, right? Like my perceptual belief is justified because there's a red sensation in there somewhere. So if that's not the case, then can I say that I know that there's a red apple in front of me, right? Can I justify any of my perceptual beliefs if direct realism is true or false? Yeah, they would. But the point of naive realism is when you look further into this, you realize that it just can't work that way, right? Maybe some form of direct realism other than naive realism works, but naive realism does not. So that's our question, right? Do we really perceive the world the way that the naive realists say we do? That is directly. Now, note, the way Crumley does this is he treats naive realism as a distinct sort of subtype of direct realism. Other thinkers don't do this. Other thinkers treat them as the same. I'm going to follow what Crumley does. So here it's a subtype of direct realism, but realists might also say that although we directly perceive the world and its objects, science can present us with facts that could be at odds with our naive views about perception. Naive realism doesn't do that. Naive realism says, like, when I open my eyes and look at the tree, that is really what the tree looks like. Um, and I'm directly perceiving it. Some of the counter arguments against naive realism and direct realism involve illusions, as was mentioned earlier in the chat. So Bishop George Berkeley, for example, had this experiment that you could do to show you that the senses do not reveal the world the way it really is directly. What you do is you take one hand and put it in some cold water. Then you put another hand and put it in some hot water. And then you take both hands out after they've been in the water and they've adapted to the temperature. Take your hands out of the water and put it in some lukewarm water. And you'll have a different temperature sensation in each hand, right? The hand that was in the cold water might experience, that hand might feel very, very warm when you put it in the lukewarm water. The hand that was in the hot water will have a colder sensation when in the lukewarm water than the other hand. But obviously, the water temperature in the lukewarm pot is the same, right? So what's going on here? The water isn't two different temperatures. No, the water's got to be one temperature. But each hand, there's a different sensation for each hand. So Berkeley thought this was evidence that, we can't be directly perceiving the world. Bertrand Russell, much, much later, would point out that the same object could look different when viewed from a different perspective, right? So a book or a table or something like that could appear square, rectangular, or diamond shaped, depending on the perspective from which you're looking at it. And then, of course, there are perceptual illusions, like this one. This is one of my favorites. Who has seen this before? This is called the Mueller-Lyer illusion. So take a look at the lines. Which line appears longer? The one on the top or the one on the bottom? Yeah, the one on the bottom. But both lines are, of course, the same length, right? The top line looking shorter and the bottom looking longer. That's an illusion. And Type says they look the same. Yeah, and some people are less susceptible to this, by the way. Why this happens, we're not entirely sure, but it's probably got something to do with these little processing cues doing something in early stages of visual processing. And it's probably tricking up our brains when it comes to like depth and perspective. Incidentally, Westerners who live in very square environments, right, very angular environments, tend to be more susceptible to this. So if you live in like a house or an apartment where the walls are square, very angular, you're more susceptible to this. But if you're from a community that lives where things are rounder, like for example, certain communities in Africa and Asia build homes that are not as angular, they're rounder, and they are less susceptible to this illusion, which is very interesting. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the arrows are switched, but it's the switching of the arrows that causes the illusion in those that are susceptible to it, right? So we know, despite how it appears, that the lines are the same length, but that doesn't necessarily stop you from experiencing the lines as different lengths, right? Hmm. That's interesting, Galen, about your depth perception. Yeah, people's environments could play a role. Um, and that's not directly because of the environments. That's maybe more to do with the way our brains have sort of wired themselves up during development, right? Here's another fun one. This is the cafe wall illusion. Um, this is kind of inspired by a real cafe wall where some person who did the tiles for the cafe wall did them in such a way that it looks like all of these horizontal gray lines are crooked, but they're not. It's like if you look closely, you can see that they're straight lines, but it doesn't look that way, does it? And the psychologist Richard Gregory noticed this in a cafe that he frequented, and I guess sort of appropriate it and called it the cafe wall illusion. I don't know the what it's called in the trade. Like if you're somebody like someone who lays tile, you've probably got a technical name for this in your trade, right? I don't know what it is, but philosophers and psychologists call it the cafe wall illusion because it's from this cafe in like I think Bristol in the UK. So does that can you experience do you see this illusion? Are you experiencing this illusion now? Pretty cool, right? So again, like these gray lines, these are straight. If you look close, you can see that they're straight. But if you back up, it looks very messy. Yusuf can also unsee it. Yeah, like I find if I look very closely at the gray lines, I can see that there's an individual gray line is straight, but then when I step back and look at the whole thing, it gets kind of crooked again, right? This is the Ebbinghaus illusion, another fun one. See the blue circles, how one looks smaller than the other? Well, they're actually the same size. Yeah. And you can check, right? You could take a ruler. You can try it right now if you have a ruler on you, hold it up to the screen and measure the size of each circle. And you will see that they are actually the same size of the blue circles. This one also reminds me of the moon illusion, which you can see, well, kind of whenever there's a clear night, whenever we have a nice big full moon. We had a full moon recently, but I didn't go out and check for the moon illusion. But has it ever happened to you that when you went outside and the moon was on the horizon, it looked absolutely huge compared to when it's up in the sky? Typh, you don't see the illusion? You don't see the two blue circles, the different sizes? Oh, wow, that's weird. Interesting. Interesting. What size screen are you watching this on? On a MacBook, eh? Interesting. I wonder why that is. Maybe your brain is just wired up a little differently. Um, which is kind of cool, right? Like, why do most of us succumb to these illusions, but certain other people don't? That's an interesting question. That's an interesting sort of cognitive science sort of question. Maybe something some of you might be interested in studying down the road. But yeah, the moon illusion, when the moon is on the horizon, it looks enormous, and then it's up in the sky and it looks smaller. That is also an illusion. The moon is no larger or smaller. No it's not significantly larger or smaller um, when it's on the horizon versus when it's in the sky. And you can check this again with a ruler. You could actually measure the what we call the angular size of the moon on the horizon versus when it's up overhead, and you'll see that it's the same. It's the same angular size. Yeah, interesting. So Jaden's maybe going the opposite way, where the more you look, the more you get the illusion. Here's another one that I like, the neon color spreading illusion. See the blue circle? Yeah, that's funny. So Jaden, it affects you more, and it affects Ian less. Oh, but Ian's using a very large screen. Fair. Could be like the dress. Maybe viewing conditions play a role, right? Do you see the blue circle here? Well, there is no circle. There is no blue circle. What we're seeing here is that these black circles that are kind of nested in one another, some of those lines are blue, but then you see this other circle around here. That circle is not there. So yeah, that's an interesting one too. Yeah, somebody mentioned, and I'm actually not sure how this is pronounced, Ames room or Ami's room. I'm glad you mentioned that. So, who here has seen the Lord of the Rings films? So, oh, not fully. Oh, that's your homework, Jaden. Yeah, I agree, Galen. I think the Lord of the Rings were like the last great big cinematic films before everything got all CGI'd to hell. But, apropos of that, the scenes when, take for example when Gandalf shows up and he's talking with Frodo, and in particular the scene when they're in Bilbo's house and Frodo is there. And Gandalf is explaining that the ring Bilbo gave him is the One Ring, and Gandalf is at the table. Frodo's at the table, and it looks like Gandalf is enormous and Frodo is hobbit-sized. That was done in camera. Um, that was not green screen, blue screen. That was not CGI. They were both in the same room when they did that. And how they did that was by taking advantage of the AIMS or AMS, or I don't know how it's pronounced, but they actually took advantage of that illusion in order to do this. So that was all captured in camera. There are actually very few scenes where they use a green screen or a blue screen when they've got the hobbits and everyone else. It's actually camera trickery and perspective. So that's pretty cool. A lot of you are talking about watching the extended edition. What you should also do is watch the little featurettes, how they made the film. And there's actually a lot that has to do with what we're talking about today that went into producing, the effect of having the hobbits looking so small compared to like Gandalf and Aragorn and everybody, even though oftentimes, they were on the same set at the same time, in camera at the same time. So that's quite fascinating. Oh, it's getting awfully cold out here. Oh. So let's talk about an alternative to direct realism. Right? I mean, well, you get the point of all of those illusions, right? We're seeing things that are different than they actually are. Or, like in the case of neon color spreading, we're seeing something that isn't even there. I agree. Whenever I see them all like hanging out and like Ian McKellen and Elijah Wood are the same size, I'm like, oh, that's weird. That's weird, man. But we see the point of the illusions, right? The illusions make things appear other than they are, or sometimes we see things that aren't even there. And naive realism can't really account for that. So an alternative is direct or indirect realism. There are a bunch of different forms of this, but what they all basically boil down to is the claim that we have these internal states, these mental representations that represent the objects that are external to us. And it's on that basis that we infer their existence. So when I look at this tree, what I am experiencing is not the tree directly, but my mental representation of the tree. And on that basis, I infer that there must be a tree there, right? Think about it like, you're in a submarine or something and you're operating the sonar and you send a sonar pulse out and it hits something and bounces back and you're like, oh, there's something. The sonar pulse returned, from right over there, so there must be something there, right? You can't like open a window and look and see what it is because you're under the ocean, but on the basis of that sonar pulse returning, you infer that there's something there. And then maybe based on the characteristic of the echo that you're detecting, you can infer what it is. Is it another submarine? Is it a whale? Is it a rock? What is it? You can infer, right? So when I see the tree, the picnic table, the coffee cup, whatever, what I'm having are not experiences of the objects directly, but rather I'm mentally representing them. It's kind of like that painting. I always mean to put this in my slides, and then I never do. But have you guys ever seen that painting, The Treachery of Images by Rene Magritte? Sean, that's a big question. Okay, so could a naive realist claim that they are still right and all errors are due to human perception? Well, I mean, the idea is that there's not that much that can go wrong. You're just directly experiencing things. Um, I mean, it just naive realism is just it's just not feasible. Maybe some other form of direct realism is, but then that would cease to be naive realism. Okay, the treachery of images. Do we know this painting? I guess not. Someone want to Google it? I'll try and pull it up on my screen. I meant to put this in the slides, but for some reason I always forget to do this. Actually, wait, I have it saved on my computer. I'll show you. We'll go to look at all. I've got lots of photos here. Turtles, teaching images. This is where I keep all the images I use to put my slides together. Let's see if we can find it. There it is. Let's open it up. Can anyone read what that says? If you understand French? Yeah, the pipe one. That's right. What's that say? Ceci n'est pas une pipe. Yeah, this is not a pipe. Of course it's a pipe. What are you talking about? Well, it's a representation of a pipe. Just like my representation of the world is not the world itself, but merely a representation. And that's what indirect realism claims. Right? We've got these internal mental states, these mental representations, and they represent the objects, but they are not the objects themselves. Okay, let's talk about the notion of sense data. Oh my goodness, it's really cold out here. Seems to be getting colder. Sense data is how we used to refer to the perceived qualities of objects. And the term is due to Bertrand Russell. I've got a lot of typos on this set of slides, so I apologize. I've actually spelled Russell's name wrong. But anyway, he wrote, let us give the name sense data to the things that are immediately known in sensation, such things as colors, sounds, smells, hardness, roughness, and so on. We shall give the name sensation to the experience of being immediately aware of these things. Thus, whenever we see a color, we have a sensation of the color. But the color itself is a sense datum, not a sensation. The color is that of which we are immediately aware, and the awareness itself is a sensation. So to make sense of this, if I go back to the tree, right, the sense data is the green, and my sensation of the green is my sensation. So the qualities are the sense data, and our experiences of those qualities is the sensation. So there's data, if you like, something about that leaf that makes it green. That's the sense data. And my becoming aware of the greenness is the sensation. This might sound a little funny, and it is. We don't really talk about sense data anymore. Um, but here are some common features to different theories that use the notion of sense data. One is that sense data theories provide, or rather divide the perceptual processes into sensing and perceiving. And this is actually something that's very much still current in psychology. And I think in the cognitive sciences more generally, right? Sensing is like, if I looked and I sensed the tree, I might look up and see a a bunch of green patches, but I don't perceive the tree until my mind categorizes it as a tree. So perception is more of a mental, like a cognitive process, a full-blown cognitive process. Um, Sense data, number two, sense data are also counted amongst our mental objects or mental representations. So sense data are mind dependent, not mind independent. And finally, experience or sensations can be conceptualized or unconceptualized. Like, have you ever looked at one of those ambiguous figures? Where you're not exactly sure what it is, and then all of a sudden, boom, you perceive it as something? Like, I'm thinking here of like the Necker cube or the duck rabbit or something like that. You can look at something and not quite have the right idea of what you're seeing. That's like unconceptualized sensation. And then when you apply the concept and categorize what you're sensing, then it becomes perceptual, and that's conceptualized content. Yeah, the well, the mental yeah, the mental occurrence of the sensation would be like a sense datum, and then your perception would be your, like, oh, there I am in the mirror. Oh, it's so cold. Oh, I feel like I'm directly perceiving how cold it is right now. Oh, wouldn't be surprised if we got some snow or something like this, although it is quite sunny, so I don't expect that's going to happen. What am I going to do in the wintertime? Yeah, I should have worn my proper coat and a hat. For goodness sake, I didn't bring a hat. Um, so let's skip through the example. I mean, does anyone have any questions? Because I'll be honest, I'm just very, very cold, and I would like to get through this. Yeah, we could build a giant igloo around this location, and I could have a little fire in it, I suppose. No, I'm not forced to do it. Oh, so it's a very strange situation, right? Like, I have a class right after this, um, and this class is online, and the class immediately after this is in person. Yet I'm supposed to teach this online class synchronously, like live, but I don't have anywhere to do it. And I honestly, this has never happened before. I don't know what whoever it is that decides where and when classes occur, I don't know what they were thinking. But anyway, here we are. Uh, so conceptualized is when you've sort of categorized the sensation or sensations and you perceive an object. It's when you apply a concept. So concept, again, a technical term in philosophy, which means like something like a mental item, a mental representation of something. And we all have lots of concepts. Like, for example, I might have the concept of a tree, which would include what trees look like. It would include information about trees, like that they photosynthesize, that they grow in the ground, that they're made of wood, etc. And so I can look at some weird tree-shaped object, um, some patchy sort of brown, trunky, green, leafy sort of collection of sensations. And that's unconceptualized. But then when my concept gets applied, and basically, my brain kind of goes like, this weird, trunky, leafy bunch of sensations matches my tree concept, then I perceive it as a tree. And that is conceptualized because I've applied the concept. Does that make sense, Maddie? Yeah. I mean, and you can try this too. Like, there are all these illusions on the internet. You can find, like, oh, find the hidden thing in this image. And it looks like the image is just like visual noise, but there is an actual image in there. When you see the image, that's conceptualized content. That's a perception. When you're just kind of scanning the image and you don't know what's what, that is unconceptualized, like sensation, sort of thing, right? No, problems with the notion of sense data. Just what are they? And this is kind of why we don't really talk about sense data anymore. Are they physical? Are they brain states? Like if I see the tree here, and I get the sense data that there's green and brown in my experience, where is it? We've already decided it's not in the object, right? We're dispensing with the naive realist view that it's that sensations that the sensible qualities are in the objects. Um, but if sense data are physical, they've got to have something to do with what's happening in my brain. But there's nothing green in my brain either, right? Or likewise, say I look at a red apple on the table, I'm seeing that red apple and I'm seeing, oh, it's red. It probably tastes sweet when I take a bite out of it. But there's nothing red in my brain when I see the apple. There's nothing sweet in my brain when I take a bite out of it. And then, of course, it gets even worse if you want to think of them as non-physical. If sense data are non-physical, then well, how do they even have color or taste? These are physical things, aren't they? So we don't see this notion used very much in contemporary philosophy. So another version of representative realism, of indirect realism, is called representative realism. And here, what we are immediately aware of are our mental representations of these objects. Um, there are external objects. They exist. They cause sensations in us, which ultimately cause perceptions in us. So sometimes we call this the causal representative theory, because the idea is, again, there are these mind independent objects that cause us to have certain sensations and perceptions, right? The light reflects off of the tree, reaches my retina, eventually winds up in my brain, and after a whole bunch of very complicated processes occur, I perceive the tree. And that's because something about the environment has caused in me the mental representation of a tree. Like, what do you mean, William? Like a dream or imagination? Stuff like that? Like, how can I imagine something I've never seen before? Um, well, a lot of philosophers would say, well, your mind just uses what it knows to try and generate an image of what it doesn't know. Um, think of the beasts from mythology, right? Winged horses don't exist, but horses do, and winged creatures do. So we can just kind of put things together and imagine a winged horse, right? Like, are you asking how do we get mental representations of things without experiencing them? Or are you asking whether there are certain things that are innate in the mind? The first one, okay, yeah. I think the mind kind of just generates what we think something might be like based on what it's already got, right? Um, like when we imagine something. Yeah. Now we come to John Locke. Yeah, like think about it, William. Like what's something you can imagine that you've never seen or experienced or anything before? And we'll try to work our way back because this is kind of fun. And I think we have time. So yeah, like what's something you can imagine that you've never experienced? What's something you can mentally represent that you've never experienced? Aliens. Yeah. So, how do you imagine aliens? Are they humanoid or are they like non-humanoid? Okay. So maybe what you're doing, excuse me, maybe what you're doing is drawing upon very, strange life forms on Earth that you've seen to inform, how you imagine aliens, like weird things that look on like that live under the sea, right? Yeah, like not on Earth. Like, yeah, you're probably using what you've got to create something new. It could. Like when I think of aliens, I guess I do t tend to think of humanoid aliens first, and I think that's because I'm a big science fiction fan, right? Like I love Star Trek and Star Wars and all of that stuff. So, and because of the way, because we're on Earth and we can't get actual aliens, we just take a human and give them, I don't know, pointy ears or green skin or antennas or something and say that's an alien. So that could be one way of doing it, right? But it's almost like how generative those generative AIs work when they come up with a new image or a video. It's because they've been trained on lots of other images or videos. And then you say, make me an image of this, and it makes it. It hasn't seen anything. It hasn't experienced anything. It can't experience anything. It's just a bit of software. Um, but it can generate this sort of representation based on the data that it's been trained on. Your brain is like that too, right? And also, I don't want to encourage AI use. Like, I don't think we should use those image video generators because, they're trained on stuff they don't have permission to be trained on. There's intellectual property issues there. They're very resource intensive, so they take a lot of water and electricity, and people use them to make AI slop and misinformation and disinformation, right? Like my Facebook reels are all AI slop now. Whenever I'm scrolling on my phone, I'm like, oh, look at this slop. It's terrible. Why are we wasting so much water and electricity doing this? So don't do that. The point is just that your brain kind of works a little bit like one of these neural networks does. Yeah, digital and creative malpractice. I like the way you put that, Khalid. Sean says most of us mentally construct aliens as something humanoid, but the overwhelming majority of life is much, much smaller, so our assumption seems to come from ourselves, experience of what we see as life, rather than what exists in the world we know. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I would say it's anthropomorphism, right? We sort of humanize aliens. It's like what did I think it was Heraclitus, the ancient Greek thinker? I could be wrong, but he said like, "Oh, we Greeks, we think our gods look like us." Um, but in Egypt, their gods look like Egyptians, and in Nubia, the gods look like Nubians. And if horses and dogs had gods, they would look like horses and dogs, right? Same kind of thing with aliens for us, perhaps. Okay, well, we're going to look at the representative realism of John Locke before we go. So, John Locke was a British empiricist who lived in the 17th century. As an empiricist, he believed that knowledge comes from sense experience. John Locke is famously the tabula rasa guy, right? The mind is a blank slate at birth. So, unlike Plato or Descartes, who believed that some knowledge was innate, unlike some rationalists. Locke said, no, the mind is a blank slate and we learn everything via experience. Um, and in the essay concerning human understanding, he writes, whatsoever the mind perceives in itself or is the immediate object of perception, thought, or understanding, I call idea. And the power to produce any idea in our mind, I call quality of the subject wherein the power is. So when I look at the tree, when I look at the leaves, say, and I see green, that's an idea, a mental representation. Locke is using idea as mental representation. The quality, the power that the object has to produce that sensation is the quality. It's just so interesting how many complex inventions are essentially just a mimicry. Yeah. Neural net. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is cool. That's a good observation, Jaden. And yes, he did lock in. He locked into empiricism. Um, So the immediate objects of perception are these ideas, the mental representations. The qualities they have are the powers that the objects have to cause those ideas in us. Now, when I say power, I mean causal power, not like magic power, right? Um, these leaves on the tree have the quality of producing green ideas in me, um, because causally, that's what they do. They cause me to have an idea of green. Light reflects off them. A lot of that light is absorbed. It's scattered all around. The stuff that reflects off is scattered all around, and some of that reaches my cones, and causes certain of them to fire in a certain way, which transmits information to my brain, such that I have this mental representation or idea of these green leaves on the trees. So it's the power is a causal one. Well, again, as it's causal potency, like I maybe you could think of it that way. I'm just saying it's a causal power, and there are two kinds of qualities: primary qualities and secondary qualities. Now, Locke didn't originate this distinction, but it's very important for making sense of what he says here. He says the ideas of primary qualities of bodies are resemblances of them, and their patterns do really exist in the bodies themselves. But the ideas produced in us by these secondary qualities have no resemblance to them at all. So primary qualities are in the objects themselves, and our sensations or ideas of these primary qualities resemble the primary qualities themselves. When it comes to secondary qualities, they produce sensations, ideas, etc., in us, but these qualities are not in the objects themselves. So our ideas of secondary qualities do not resemble the objects themselves. So, what is a primary quality for Locke? A solidity, like this table. Extension, yep. Again, like the table, it's extended in that it takes up space. Figure, motion, um, rest, quantity, right? The sorts of things that we can study with objective physical science, those are like primary qualities, and they tell us about the properties which are in the objects themselves. So Locke would have said, like, if I touch the table and feel that it's solid and extended and it has a certain shape, my sensations, my ideas of those qualities resemble the actual qualities of the object. I have this experience that the table is hard when I knock on it. That's an idea of a primary quality, which resembles the quality of the table, which is hardness. Secondary qualities are things like colors, sounds, tastes, smells, etc., and these do not exist in the objects. The objects cause our ideas of secondary qualities, but our ideas of secondary qualities do not actually resemble the objects. So when I look at the tree and I see the leaves and I see that they're green, that's a secondary quality which does not resemble the object at all. It's 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 uh it's more of a mental thing. Well, either way, it's a mental representation. But in the case of solidity, extension, etc., all of those primary qualities, my ideas of those qualities actually resemble those qualities. Not so with secondary qualities or ideas thereof. Does that make sense to all of you? Sure, you can conceptualize both kinds of qualities, Jaden, but it's just that the ideas of primary qualities do not, they resemble the actual qualities of the object. Now, we can debate this too, right? I feel the table is solid, so the table must really be solid. Is it really solid? Well, if you ask a physicist, they might tell you, actually, the table is mostly empty space, right? You have your the table's made of atoms, and atoms have their nucleus, and then they have their like electrons going around. But most of the atoms are empty space, and things feel solid because of these the electromagnetic forces that keep these electron sort of shells or orbits or whatever you want to call them from kind of getting all mushed up together. So the table feels solid. But if you look at it at a finer level of spatial temporal granularity, you see that the table is actually mostly empty space. Of course, Locke didn't know any of that, but it's not really important for our purposes. But it is interesting to note that, well, you could make an argument against Locke maybe on the basis of all of this stuff that he didn't know about physics. Okay, so Locke continues in the essay. It is evident that the mind knows not things immediately, but only by the intervention of the ideas it has of them. Our knowledge, therefore, is real only so far as there is a conformity between our ideas and the reality of things. But what shall be here the criterion? How shall the mind, when it perceives nothing but its own ideas, know they agree with the things themselves? So you can see, firstly, Locke is a representative realist, and we can see that his theory is causal, right? When he talks about powers, he means causal powers. But as we see here, how shall the mind, when it perceives nothing but its own ideas, know they agree with the things themselves? That's a problem that the skeptic can kind of challenge us on. So it's the return of the skeptic. So there are some problems with Locke's view. And we're going to see if we can try and redress them next time. We're also going to turn towards George Berkeley's phenomenalism, or sometimes it's called subjective idealism, which is the idea that there are no physical objects. It's all just mental objects. So all of our problems are solved. If, well, what if we're not perceiving things directly? How do we know that? Well, we don't have to worry about that if there are no physical objects, right? So that's what we're going to look at next Tuesday when we finish off the unit on perception. And then on Thursday, we'll start universals. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Do you find it a little unnerving? Like, I just we'll close off. Just I want to put this question to you as a sort of closer, but again, Locke's question here: how shall the mind, when it perceives nothing but its own ideas, know they agree with the things themselves? Do you find that a little unnerving that we don't directly perceive the world, but the mind only perceives its own ideas? Does this worry you? No, only a tiny bit, as long as I'm having fun. Good. Well, maybe I'll worry you then with some of the concerns of the skeptic next time. Because now we're back to the problems that Descartes was facing. How do I know anything? How do I know that I know anything at all? Yeah, it is cool. Okay, well, we finished the material and I am very cold. So I think what I'm going to do is finish the lecture. So good job, everyone. We made it to the end. I hope it's warmer next week. Yeah, gotta grab another coffee. Hey, it's Thanksgiving next Monday, right? Yeah, no school on Thanksgiving Monday. So I hope you have a good long weekend, everybody. If you're traveling home, safe travels. Have a good weekend. If you're staying here, I hope you're able to get together with some of your new friends that you've made, and have a little nice little Thanksgiving get together, perhaps with some of your friends. But whatever you do, um, I hope you have a good weekend, and I hope you stay safe and stay warm. And yeah, happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Thanks, gangsta. That's great. Thank you, gangsta. Um, all right, off I go to warm up and find some coffee. Bye for now, everyone.